I hope that you are all able to join us for the part one of my testimony. If not, please go back and listen to the grace that the Lord has poured out upon me, which is really a testimony about Him. I invite you to listen to part one of how I came out of the life of an atheist, how I came into being born again. This is part two of my testimony from the time that I was born again to the time that how I found God's true church here on earth. After I came to know the Lord and I realized that fateful night that my brother and I were driving up to Oregon, and I realized that I was no longer an atheist, but I was actually a bona fide born again Christian. And that was between December 12th of 94, of when my husband and I were born again, to December. This would have been, he died January 19th of 95. So this time era of what I'm talking about would be near the end of January of 95. Not really fully understanding what I was going through as an atheist. And when I finally woke up that morning after that fateful evening of trying to think if I was just kind of making all this up of what was happening in me, and then it was like God just disappeared from my life, and all that pain came upon me. And after I then realized my error, and I asked God to forgive me and to come back again, and He did that next morning. I went back to work again after 2 months of being off after my husband had passed away. I couldn't handle dealing with life that much. I had mentioned earlier in part one that Mike's work had given us they had an auction, an online auction for us, which we both ended up being so grateful for. That money stayed with us. We had enough money for both of us to stay off work while he was going through that dying process, and then for another 2 months for me to get my thoughts and my life back together again after he died. And after I felt like I was emotionally ready to go back to work again, that was when the money ran out that came in from the donations. And we just, that was purely a gift from God, and which I was so thankful for. And when I went back to work, the first thing that I told my boss was that I'm not the person who left anymore, and I needed to reapply for the job again. And my boss, her name was Jill, she looked at me and she said, I don't think that you need to reapply, but why do you think you need to reapply? And I said, look, I left a fiance, I left an atheist, and having nursing my dying husband through what I thought was going to be to life. But now I've come back, and I've now gone through a wedding, and I've gone through a burial, and I've buried my husband, and I've now become a born again Christian. And I am not the same person as when I left. And I really feel like I need to reapply because I'm an imposter. I am not who I was before. And she just contemplatively looked at me, sat back in her chair, and she says, I think you're okay. I don't think you need to reapply for the job again. But that does say how much I believed I really changed in my thoughts and in my beliefs. I knew I was a new creature in Christ, and I knew that I was out for a new life. So during this time of realizing that, hey, God really is real, and hey, I'm not an atheist anymore, I couldn't help but to share that love that was being poured into me. I was sharing with my niece She was 7 years old at the time, and she was such such a joy in my life. I'd share with her about Christ and what he's been doing for me time and time and time again. So we both, my sister and I lived in Redlands, and my brother right across the street from each other for quite a while. And so I would pop over to my sister's house and see my brother and my niece and nephew, and we often spent time together. And I would be um, telling my little niece what I guess this was before that time, so we all lived together shortly after this, the story I'm going to tell you. So we were actually down in the San Diego area, and I was talking to my little niece about the Lord, and she knew obviously how much I had changed. I think my whole family knew how much I had changed, and how much more peaceful and loving and compassionate I'd becoming, a lot more patient with people. Um, it was just pretty obvious that I had changed. My whole thought process had changed. My belief system had changed. And how could people not see the joy that I had in my life? The joy did not come from my husband's death, but instead it came from the joy that God saved him before he died. For that, I have never said to myself, why me? I have never grieved away his death to the point where I've been angry or put my fist to God. It never occurred to me to even think like that, because my gratefulness just overshadowed everything negative that happened, and I was the one who had to run the good race. So my little niece, as I was talking to her about the Lord, she says, I'd really like to know the Lord too. So we sat on the garage of the floor in her mom's house, and she accepted the Lord, and she just became a little missionary herself, and God just embedded in her that love and that peace and that deep joy that God brings to those who are born again. And so now my sister is seeing the change in her daughter, seeing the change in me, her sister. And one time when I was sharing the Lord with her, she came to me and said, I'd really like to have the Lord too. I want what you have and what my daughter has. So there in the backyard, my sister accepted the Lord as well. And the brother that I had shared going up to Oregon with, of course, I continued to share with him what was happening with me. And I asked him to attend an evangelistic meeting with me. It was a huge evangelistic meeting with thousands and thousands of people at a big auditorium, a stadium, and he did agree to go with me. And I had a girlfriend with me who had two front row seats, so we were going to do two front row seats, and then my brother was going to sit somewhere else, and he ended up sitting way up in the top of the bleachers. And I told my brother before we parted, I said, okay, we will meet you afterwards. So during that evangelistic outreach, I just prayed and prayed and prayed, nonstop prayer during that whole time, during the music, during the message, during the prayers, then during the a time of commitment when the speaker was asking if anybody would like to accept the Lord. I just kept praying, God, please let my brother be one of those people that were heading down the stadium stairs. And all I could do was just continue to pray, because I didn't know where he was. I had no idea to see him. The stadium was huge. Afterwards, I was meeting him at the appointed place, and I could see far, far off. I could see my brother coming from a far distant location, because he had come out a very different door than what we came out. I could see from the distance that he was walking different. I could see that he was a changed man as he approached me. And it was such a beautiful reunion. And he just we ran into each other's arms, and we just started crying because I he didn't have to say anything to me. I knew he was a changed man. I knew he accepted the Lord, and the Lord was right there with him. And we embraced each other, and we're filled with tears of joy. And and on my shoulder, he just said, "I'm a Jesus freak, just like you now, sis." And so now there's family members who are coming to the Lord. I had invited my another brother and my dad and several others. Not everyone has continued on with that walk over the years, but this is what happened back then. And I was telling my dad, that about the Lord as well, and he said, can I accept the Lord because I want to be with my kids in heaven? And so we went to my backyard and sat on a couple of lawn chairs, and he accepted the Lord. This was a time of a great rejoicing, a time when I was sharing what the Lord had been doing with me. And it was so obvious that I was such a changed person, just filled with joy and filled with love and a new direction in my life. Many friends came to the Lord. I met new friends. Many staff of people that I was working with came to the Lord, and ancillary staff, people who had walked away from the Lord were coming back to the Lord. Many of my patients accepted the Lord, and many of them, before they died, I prayed in their ear with them. I don't know if they could hear me or not. It didn't matter to me, but I just remembered Jan Kinney's story from part one of my story. But if she could hear, possibly my patients could hear, and I wanted to walk them through the valley of death peacefully. So I prayed with many of them. After patients would die, I would pray with their families. It was just a time of great rejoicing, and there were people everywhere accepting the Lord. It was a great revival happening right around my life, and I couldn't have asked for a better life. We were known for being a very what other people would say, a hard group of nurses when we worked in the ICU, intensive care unit, burn national or regional burn center. And many nurses, most nurses, I don't know of any that liked to float, because in an ICU, there has to be a certain ratio of nurses to patients, and then it depends on their severity. And many times it could be two nurses on one patient. It could be one nurse having two patients, or one, or if patients were well enough and some of them were ready to be discharged, a nurse may have two patients. But it was very, very intense work. When you have two nurses on one patient, that kind of gives you an idea of how intense it was. And the nurses had to know what they were doing, and had to be a team in saving people. And as I'm sharing the Lord with nurses and with the respiratory therapists and other people who were medical people who were coming in, many of them were coming to know the Lord. It was just a great revival. Let's see, I lost my place. So yeah, we were considered to be a pretty hard group of nurses, and no nurses like to float to us, because if we were ever short-staffed, then nurses would have to float from another place where they were maybe overbooked or something. And there were even a couple of nurses, one in particular that I knew, that actually quit because she was told that she had to float to us, and she did not want to, so she quit. And then another nurse came, and we would often hear about these issues of what's happening in the rest of the hospital, because we were pretty hard. You kind of have to be, nurses do kind of get a little hard, working in that kind of situation, because you have to know what you're doing. You have to be focused. And then there was one nurse who came and asked. This was like a year later, after the patients are coming to know the Lord, the families and other nurses, and it was just during this time of great revival. So a year later, there was another nurse that came in, and she said, "I'd like to talk to Janie." And I said, "That's me. What can I do for you?" Because I was the head nurse that evening, and she said, "I've been hearing rumors, and I just had to see it for myself. That I actually want you to know that I chose to float here when they asked for volunteers." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. Why did you choose to float here when I know that nurses actually quit before they ever would float here?" And she says, "Because I'm a Christian, and I have heard that word has gotten all around the hospital that the burn unit nurses are now Christians, and that they are nice to work with now, and that they aren't so hard." And I said, "Oh, well, that's interesting." And so I was able to share my testimony with her about what's happened to my life, and about what the Lord has been doing over that year. I think she left a new person as well, just completely renewed, because by the time her shift got over with, she thanked me for that opportunity to work. There were really only about two nurses left that didn't accept the Lord before I left the burn unit to move on to other travels that the Lord led me on. But I assured them both that I would pray for them for the rest of my life. And I don't know where they are today in the world, what they're doing, but I still do pray for them. As my sister, I shared, who came to know the Lord with her daughter, and she also had a son, and she asked me if I would go to a family camp, a Christian camp with them. And I said, "Well, I don't have a family. I'm alone, so they probably don't have anything for me." And she said, "Well, you can be part of our family. You can be with us." And I said, "Well, okay." And the battle of my life began, because as soon as we got off the phone, I said, "No, I'm not going." And then she'd wait and call me and say, "Why aren't you here?" And I'd say, "Well, I changed my mind." And then she talked me into coming again. And I would say, "Okay." And I'd get off the phone and I'd say, "No, I'm not coming again." It was a battle of it was a battle of my mind of what was happening. It was very interesting. And my sister and I did that probably 4 or 5 times. She'd say, "Where are you?" And I'd say, "Well, I changed my mind. I'm not coming." She talked me into coming, and I'd say I would, and then I wouldn't show up, because after I get off the phone, I decide I don't want to go. Finally, I couldn't get a hold of her to. I got off the phone with her after telling her I would go, and I said, "This is crazy. I just need to tell her that I'm not going to go." So I tried to call her, and the family camp was about 45 or 50 minutes from my house, and I couldn't get a hold of her or anybody. So I finally thought, okay, I'm just going to jump in the car, and I'm going to tell her that I'm not going to stay. And so I jumped in the car, and while I was and my sister told me that there's some wonderful missionaries that are there. And I said, "What do you mean, being a missionary, leaving the country? Because I can't even hardly leave my house. And you want me to leave the country?" I said, "That's just not possible." And I said, I have no interest in meeting anyone. And I don't want to be a missionary. And I don't even want to leave the house. I don't even want to leave the country. I can't even hardly work. And so I told her that I did not want to meet these people. And so I'm now driving up to the family camp to tell her that I am not going. While I was driving up there, I had an interesting um, situation happen, and where my heart just started to really stir within me. And I started having these thoughts that I didn't know where they came from, but these thoughts that I was to be a missionary. And I kept pushing the thoughts away, pushing them away, and the thoughts just kept coming to me, and my heart kept getting bigger and bigger until I knew that something bigger than me was actually speaking to me, and it wasn't my own mind. Um, and it wasn't a voice, it was just this peace and this knowledge that came over me. It was like the same knowledge, how it just came instantly to me when I knew that instantly Jesus was God, and that part of that story. Um, and I had this instant knowledge that I was to be a missionary. And I just kept saying, no, I am not going to be a missionary. I can't even get out of bed in the morning, hardly even go to work, much less even leave the country. I'm not ready for that. I'm not emotionally ready. I'm not physically ready. I'm not spiritually ready. I'm just not ready, God. If this is you calling me, I'm not ready. And I knew that just something told me that this was the Lord speaking to my heart. I but my heart kept getting bigger and bigger, and I remember touching my heart and looking at my hands again and thinking that this is bigger than me again, that this must be God. And I couldn't help but the chatter in my mind saying that I was to be a missionary, until finally, after about 15 minutes of this going on between my heart and my mind in this battle, and I want you to be a missionary, and I don't want to be a missionary, but yet I know that's what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be saying yes, but I know that I can't even get out of bed in the morning hardly. And finally, I remember driving, and I remember the palm of my hand hitting the steering wheel, and I said, "Fine, God, I will go be a missionary, but I'm not ready. And if this is you, you have to make me ready, because I'm not there. I can hardly get out of bed. I can hardly go to work. I can hardly go to the grocery store. I can't even call my friends. I have to wait for them to call me. I can't even pick up the phone just to call someone, just to talk. And you want me to leave the country? I just don't see how that's possible. But if this is you, then you make me ready." And all of a sudden, I got this peace that passes all understanding. It was from John 14:27. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I leave not unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." I had read that verse several times. I and that verse just came back to me, and it all was peaceful in my mind, and all was peaceful in my heart, and all I knew was that next thought was, "You've made the right decision." And then there was no more chatter, and all was peaceful. I got up there to my sister's, the camp where she was at, and I told her that I wasn't staying, and she said, "You have to meet these missionaries." And all of a sudden, when she said that again, I just knew that I had to meet them. So I went to the talk that they were giving, which happened to be at the moment that I got there. We listened, and I couldn't believe how that was speaking to my heart. It was like they were speaking directly to me. And it was so overwhelming to me that I was compelled to go talk to them afterwards. As much as I really struggled in my mind about the reality of leaving the country when I could hardly get out of bed in the morning, how I could leave the country, but I was so compelled. I was drawn to them like a magnet. And I went to go talk to them. And through our conversation, they invited me to, it was a Baptist couple working down in Mexico. And they had worked with me, or had talked with me to the point where we actually became friendly, and they invited me to join them on their mission. I knew that was the right thing to do. I told them that I believed that the Lord was calling me now, but I just didn't know how it was going to happen, or when or under what circumstances. As time went by, a couple months later, I actually did go visit them down in Mexico. And I just knew that I was doing the right thing. I was digging ditches. I was making visits with people. I was doing like medical missionary work, um, helping people with their medical ailments, and helping them through the nursing knowledge that I had gained over the years, and just doing visits with people. And I just absolutely loved it. Couldn't believe how much it just really touched my heart, among the poorest of the poor. And my heart went out to them. And these are people who had tires, old tires for walls, and thatch roofs where sometimes rain would get in, or pieces of tin would be put upon each other to make a roof, dirt floors. But I loved it, just absolutely loved it. Slept with the local people, ate with the local people, and slept and lived like they did for those weeks that I was there. Just loved it. That was where I got my love of mission trips and helping people in a whole new kind of way. I was finally able to get out of myself and stop living for myself and start living for others, and starting to help others in a whole new way. Then when I came back, I started asking the Lord, where would you like me to go? Because what was happening at my job was I was working 60 to even 80 hours sometimes a week, and I would be banking those extra hours and not getting paid for them directly, but taking them as a vacation. I would then be called by the human resources department, and they would tell me that it was time for me to take my vacation or lose it, because I would be at the maximum allowable vacation. And so I would go home and ask the Lord, where would you like me to go? And when? So I would start calling mission places around the world and all the organizations that I knew. And just the first place that said that they wanted a nurse, I would start going. So I started going down to different places in Mexico, um, uh, and there was a group that I had called from Loma Linda, the Loma Linda Sims group, the Student International Mission Services. And then I started going down once a month as I was able to go down to another place in Mexico. No one had ever um, asked me about the Sabbath. No one ever asked me about my beliefs. No one ever asked me. I think, people knew what day I went to church. When we went down there to Nogales, we had a church service on Saturdays, which didn't bother me. And then we just had uh, an all day health event where we would help the local people with their medical needs, and we would help them with eyeglasses and um, uh, prescription medications, whatever health needs that they had for that time. So I was doing that, and then I was doing 2 weeks here and 2 weeks there, and other places around the world, and wherever God would call, as I was getting more and more vacation. So I was doing more and more mission trips, and going to many different places. Started doing health lectures at some places. I was helping other health missionaries to start up their own health programs. I was giving health lectures with a pastor, doing just whatever kind of was needed. And some of them I went with another group. If I remember right, it was another Baptist group that went to an Indian reserve, and we were just building decks and painting the fences and helping people fix up their homes. And then when they found out that I was a nurse, they asked me if I would see some people who had some health needs. And so started branching out. I just kind of did whatever needed to be done. I had no preconceived ideas about anything. I just did whatever needed to be done at every single mission trip that I ever went on. And then my boss, she came to me. Well, I had told her that I was going to yet leave again, and that the Lord had called me to go to a certain mission trip, and she looked at me and she said, "Well, do you think that you better find another job?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Let me think about it and get back to you tomorrow." So that night after work, I I got down on my knees and I prayed and I said, God, is this your way of telling me that you don't want me in this job anymore? So you guide me. I don't really know what to do, but I believe that you've called me to go on this mission trip at this certain date, just like all the other places and dates that I've been on. I believe that you've called me to this one as well. And I believe I was going to Belize for this particular mission trip. And I said, God, if you have called me to go on this mission trip, then, because I was laying out a fleece now, and if you still want me to keep the job and you want me to go on the mission trip, then you're going to have to put it in her, my boss, in her heart to come to me and tell me that it's okay that I go on this mission trip at this particular time. I'm not going to approach her, but I'm going to let you work with her, and then she will come to me. Then that way I know that my hands are completely off the situation, and I am not creating a situation to either happen or not happen. So I'm just going to leave this with you. I went to work the next day, and she, and then I also told the Lord that have her not change her mind, because I know that you have called me to go on this mission trip. I have no doubt about it at this time. So if this is not of, you want me to not work here anymore, then have her not change her mind, and I'll know that it's time for me to go look for a new job. So she came to me the next day. I wasn't for sure what the answer was going to be, but she said, do you still want to go on that mission trip that you were telling me about yesterday? And I said, yes. And she said, you know what? I've been thinking that over, and I should have never said that. You are free to go whenever you want to go, and I will never say that again. So I knew that this was God's calling for me. And I continued on my mission trips every several months to different countries, Colombia several times, Brazil several times. And well, not Brazil yet, I should say. I wanted to go to Brazil because one of the things that God had put on my heart was that I wanted to go to the Amazon. I really, really wanted to work South and Central America. I was just so looking forward to that. So I was, at one point I knew that the Lord was calling me to do a longer term mission. So I called around, and there was no Christian organizations, zero. I called probably 20, 30 different Christian organizations, and I knew that God was calling me, but I didn't know where he wanted me to go. So I signed up with a secular organization, thinking that was where the Lord wanted me to go, and I was set to go at a certain date. And they gave me a location of where I was going to go, and that it was in the future, about a year in the future. So I kept on with my mission work throughout that time, or maybe it was 6 or 9 months. Maybe it wasn't quite that long. Whatever it was, though, it was many months in the future. And finally, as the time goes by, I talked to my mom, and I said, Mom, I feel like I'm doing the wrong thing. I feel like I'm not supposed to be going with this group, but I feel like I'm supposed to be going with a Christian group. I feel like I'm doing the wrong thing. And she says, well, why don't you go talk to my friend at Loma Linda University? And I said, well, I'm not an Adventist. And she says, well, you weren't an Adventist, and you've been on all these other mission trips. And my mom's not an Adventist either. But she had an Adventist friend there. And so I said, no, they won't accept me long term. These are short term missions. And she says, well, you don't know unless you ask. So that night I started to fast, and I started to pray. And I said, Lord, I just feel like I'm doing the wrong thing. I feel like I'm supposed to be going with a Christian group, and what I'm doing is wrong. So may you guide me. I don't know what to do, but the only place I know at the moment is, because no other place wants a nurse, which is completely unheard of. So I'm going to go see my mom's friend at Loma Linda University who works in the missions program. And I'm going to see if she has a place in Brazil to go to. I had tried to go to Brazil a few months earlier, but I actually ended up in Italy, which is an amazing story how that all happened. But um, I'll tell you about that later on another program when I start sharing about mission stories. So how um, so that night I started to pray and fast, and I said, God, if you're in this, then have a place in Brazil. I really want to go to the Amazon. I feel like that's where you're leading me to go, and I'm really excited to go down there. So if there's no place for Brazil, then I know that you aren't leading me. I'm laying out another fleece again, and I go to this, and I know that if there is a place in Brazil, then I know that you are leading me. I continue to fast and pray. The next morning, first thing, I went to go see my mom's friend, and she had looked all through the places that they need missionary nurses, and none of them were in Brazil. So I told her that that was really where I wanted to go. So she gave me many, many places of options, and I said, no, it's got to be Brazil, because I'm already supposed to be going to this other place, and I just feel like that's where I'm supposed to be going. I just feel like I'm supposed to be going to the Amazon. And she says, well, I'm sorry, but there's no place in the Amazon. And so I left, realizing that maybe this isn't of the Lord. She called me later in the day and asked me to come back. And I went, and she found some places in Central America. And I said, no, I know it's Brazil on the Amazon. And then she called back east to Adra, and which I didn't know who that was at the time. And they looked all around and said, no, there wasn't anything. And just around closing time, they called back and they said, there is one place in Brazil for her on the Amazon. And there happens to be a group from Loma Linda University actually going at this particular time. And so I told them, I said, well, I don't need to make my emergency your emergency, but I do have to know, because I'm supposed to be leaving in a few weeks with this other group, and I feel like I'm doing the wrong thing. So I kind of have to know right now. I don't really have time to wait. Can you tell me if this is a for sure thing? So they tried to call the pastor, and he wasn't there, who actually lived there on the Amazon. And I was told to call him myself, and they gave me his phone number, but they also wanted to let me know that the chances are pretty slim that I would ever get him, because he ran a fleet of boats, medical missionary boats, and that he's often in his little airplane flying from one boat to another, offering aid and support and renewing supplies, or seeing how his people are doing. And so, and there's times when he might be gone for a month or two or even 3 at a time, and that they couldn't get a hold of him. So that led them to believe that maybe he wasn't home for a while. I started to fast and pray again, because after I started to eat again, after I talked to her the first time, and now I started to fast and pray again. I left her. I now had the phone number of the pastor, and I laid a fleece before the Lord again. I said, Lord, I don't want to make anything happen, because I'm already on this path of going with this other group, and I don't want to make the wrong move. I've already made wrong moves before, and I don't want to do it again. So I want you to make all the moves for me. I continued to fast and pray, and my prayer that morning was, Lord, if he answers the phone, I'll know you're leading. If he doesn't answer the phone, whether it's one of his kids or a wife or anybody, then I will know it's not you leading. Have him answer the phone if you are leading. I laid a fleece that I knew was completely impossible, realizing that he may be gone for a month or 2 or 3, not knowing anything of the circumstances other than what I'd been told. I called the next morning, and the pastor answered the phone. I explained who I was, and he and that I wanted to know if he was interested in having me as a missionary down there. And when I explained, what my faith background was, he said, and that we don't really accept non-Adventists for long-term missions. And I said, oh, that's totally fine, because I totally understand, because this is not you telling me. I believe that you're being used by the Lord to help guide me, because I'm already supposed to go to this other place. And he said, well, we talked for probably 20 minutes. And he said, well, let me explain why generally that we don't allow non-Adventists for long term. Short term is no problem, but long term is a little bit different. And I said, no, you don't have to explain. And he said, well, just let me explain. As Adventists, we generally don't drink coffee. And I said, oh, I can't even stand the smell of coffee. That stuff's disgusting. I don't drink coffee. I've never drank coffee. And then he said, well, and we Adventists generally don't eat pork. And I said, well, that's really disgusting. I gave that stuff up years ago, because that's just like gross. There's all sorts of bacteria and worms and parasites that live in pigs, and I quit eating pigs years ago. And he said, well, and our women generally dress a little more modest. And then and I said, oh, I hear you. The Lord has really been working on me with my dress as well, and my clothes, and being more proper, and because I came out of that kind of a world, dressing very different than I do now, as I was telling him at that time. And then he said, and we don't drink alcohol, and don't smoke. And I said, well, I've been a smoker in my life. I've tried it a few times, but smoking is disgusting, and that I don't drink either. And I said, I gave up drinking years ago. And then he named a few other things, and I said, yes. I had to come back, just a normal conversation. I wasn't justifying or defending myself. I was just making conversation with him that I understood where he was talking about. And so he said a couple of other things, and I said, yes, the Lord has really been dealing with me on these things as well. And then he finally said, why don't you come? And I said, oh, no, you've already told me that you don't want Adventists for long-term missions, so I'm totally fine with that. And he said, no, really, I want you to come. I already know who I'd put you with. And there's another young lady missionary your age. And I know the pastor and the boat captain, and I think you'd be a great addition to that team. And I said, well, I don't know really what to say right now, because you didn't invite me at first, but now you are, so I'm kind of confused. But would you mind if I prayed about it and called you back in the morning? And then I also want to give you time not to, want to give you time to uninvite me as well, because I consider this from the Lord that you didn't invite me at first. So I just want to make sure that we're both very comfortable, that you know where I'm coming from. And I want to make sure that this is the Lord for me, and because I'm not an Adventist. And he said, no, that's fine. And so I continued to fast and pray that night. So this was all happening over like a 48-hour period, and maybe 3 days. It wasn't very long, maybe just 2. So as I'm fasting again, I lay out another fleece before the Lord. I said, Lord, I really have to know that you're leading here. Have him change his mind if this is not what you want for me. And because I have to know without a doubt. And so I called him the next morning, and we talked, and he told me, or I asked him, I should say, have you thought about your decision? And he said, well, I invited you yesterday, and the decision still stands, and I haven't uninvited you. I haven't even thought about it, haven't even given it a second thought. What about you? And I said, well, I've been in a lot of praying about it, and I asked the Lord, for your answer, that I'll accept your answer. So if you're still inviting me, then I will go. And he said, well, great. There is a group of students from Loma Linda University who are going down, and you can go then at the same time they go, and then you can get a couple of weeks experience doing jungle nursing. And when And I don't know exactly what day they're coming, but here's the phone number to the contact at Loma Linda University, and you can call them and find out when they're coming and any of the details. And I said, okay. I got off the phone with him, and I am still fasting and praying. And now this time, before I make the phone call to the contact, I'm praying again. I lay another fleece. I say, God, I'm getting closer. There's a place in Brazil, and now the pastor says yes, but I really have to know still that you're leading me here, because I don't want to disappoint this other organization, and I don't want to make a wrong move. So if this group, I am supposed to leave with this group on this trip with the non-Christians, on this certain date. And if the students from Loma Linda are leaving on the exact date that I would have left, I'll still know again that you are leading. Now, I realize that what I'm asking for again is completely impossible. I know that what is the chance of Loma Linda, these students leaving at the same time I would be leaving on my other mission trip? So I laid this fleece before the Lord, and I said that to the Lord, that if they leave on a different day than what I would have been leaving on, I'll know you're not leading. I get done with my prayer and I call the contact, and he tells me what day they're leaving. And it's the exact day that I was to leave on my other trip. He then tells me the flight that they're on, because now they're just leaving in a couple of days. And because now several days have passed, because when I first started talking to my mom, we're talking about 2 weeks, maybe even less than 2 weeks before I was supposed to have left with this other group. Now, after several days, so we're probably on day 4 now, and we're just down to maybe a week before I was supposed to be leaving. I then went in prayer again with the Lord, and I said, Lord, I have the time and date and flight number in which they are leaving. I'm going to lay another fleece to know that you are leading me, because I don't want to disappoint this group, and I don't want to do my own will. I want to do what you want me to do. It looks like this is where you're leading me, but I still have to know. And I'm going to call up the airlines, and if they have a seat available on that exact flight, then I will know that you are leading. If they don't have a seat on that flight, I will know you are not leading. I called up the airlines. They had 1 seat on that exact flight. And I could not believe it. I just, from there, it was there was just no doubt that I knew that the Lord was leading me at this point. I needed a few medical supplies. So I went to a medical supply store, and we just happened to be conversing about, they were asking me what I was doing with all these supplies. And I told them that I was going on a mission to Brazil on the Amazon, and I couldn't believe it, but the store owner told me to take whatever it was that I wanted, and that he would give me a discount. So I grabbed everything that I wanted. I didn't know what the discount was because he didn't tell me, but I figured it would probably be, worth my time to pick out what I really needed. So I picked out what I really needed, and when I took it all to the counter, he told me it was mine for no charge, a complete gift. And now, again, it's confirmation that God is leading me to do this mission trip. I have no doubt. I call up the other organization real meekly, and feeling so bad because I'm just feel like a heel after these many months, and we were kind of waiting for a spot to open up for me, and now I'm not going at the last minute. I felt so horrible. You can't imagine how that weighed on my heart. But I also knew that I could not disappoint God. I knew that He was leading me and guiding me. I had no question about it. and I just I had to go. I knew that between them and my family that I didn't want to leave my family, but I just knew because we were so close. We're all new Christians. We're all encouraging one another. We're all loving each other, going to church together. And it's just a time of great rejoicing for us. I'm now in the Lord by would have been probably a year and a half at this point. But then there was something that I read that um, that really struck me in Matthew 10:37. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And I realized that I didn't want to go, one, because of my dog that I dearly, dearly loved, and two, because of my family who I dearly loved and I was so close with. But this verse popped out at me and told me that I had to go. And then I read the Great Commission in Matthew 28. And between the Great Commission and reading this in Matthew, I realized that I had to go. And I had to leave my dog. I had to leave my family. And I knew that I was on the adventure of a lifetime. I was willing to do it, but there was still a lot of ambivalence just because I knew that I was leaving for long term. But my family would, I asked the Lord again, please, if you see fit, you know how much I love my dog, and my dog has been my life. And I have gone on missions or not gone on missions many times because of him and making sure that he can be well taken care of while I was gone. My life revolved around him. And Lord, you know how much I love him and don't want to lose him, but I know that you have a plan for me, and I know that you have a plan for him. If I can keep him, I would sure love it. And would you please, have it and place it upon the heart of one of my family members to keep him for me and to keep him safe for when I come back, because I don't even know when I'll come back. And I realized that then a family member told me that they would keep him. So I knew again, I got confirmation. I was so, so thankful, like you wouldn't believe. And I then went on my mission trip. I met up with the group from Loma Linda, and we flew on into Brazil and started then our 2-week trip with the students. Now, I wasn't a student, I was already a nurse, but I was certainly learning jungle nursing. And so I learned the ropes for the next few weeks, just learning about the ailments that people along the Amazon and in the jungle have. And then I had learned along the way that you don't want to go to the furthest west of the Amazon River because, one, the pastor doesn't often make it there, and two, there's nobody who speaks English out there. Three, there's no white people, which didn't really matter, but it bothered me that the one point that they did say was that they have pirates out there, and that would often sometimes jump ship. And I had never been away from a place where nobody looked like me, nobody believed like me, nobody, I felt like I all of a sudden grew up pretty sheltered. I mean, I've had friends from other cultures, of course, but I'm still within the confines of my own country. So it was just a little nerve-wracking. And then the last thing was that often supplies run out, and that most of the time you can't get supplies being on the furthest west of the Amazon. So after my 2 weeks of training, I went out and to the pastor, and I said, okay, where would you like me to go? And he says, you're going to Beijing. And I said, well, where is that? Well, that's the furthest west of the Amazon. I did not say anything to him. I was in complete disbelief. I turned around as fast as I could, went down to my room and got on my knees and started to scold my finger to God. and said, God, you know that was the one place I didn't want to go. I don't want to go there. I'm not going there. And I'm scared to death. There's no one who speaks English. I don't know the Portuguese language. I don't know, I don't know if I can get supplies. I can't do it. I'm scared because of pirates. The ship may get jumped, so I can't do it. And then this peace that passes all understanding came upon me and said, yes, you can, and you will, and it's okay, and I'll be with you. After this negotiating with God, he just really calmed me down, and peace came over me, and I was ready to go back to talk to the pastor. I went back and talked to him, and I think he was kind of in a little smirk, not realizing what I had gone through, but he obviously knew I was going through a challenge with being there. And one of the other things was, God, you have to be my teacher for medical, because I'm not sure if I can do this by myself. And you're going to have to be my teacher for the language, because I don't know the language. And I went back to talk to the pastor, and I said, okay, when will I leave? And he said, well, I could put you on a ferry boat that will take you there. It'll take you 4 days to get there, but you don't know the language. So I think what I'll do is I'll put you on a flight. And there's a little airplane that I could put you on. And I said, okay, that I would be much more comfortable with that, because I'm scared. I don't want to be on a boat for 4 days by myself. I don't know anything. I don't know the language. So he put me on an airplane, and the plane happened to break down halfway. And just a miracle of all miracles happened because of that, of our emergency landing. That will have to come in a different story. For now, I'm going to bypass that story, and but know that I'll share it at another time. So I got to my mission place, and because my plane had broke down, we had to make an emergency landing. There were several hours that passed. It was probably 7-8 hours that had passed. And these people didn't know where I was. The pastor didn't know where I was. Nobody knew how to get a hold of me. And so when I got to the airport, there was nobody there waiting for me. I really didn't know what to do now. So I just kind of hung out, and a bunch of us took pictures, and just continued kind of helping me to figure out what to do. And then the young lady missionary finally did come for me. Got on the boat, and within the first couple of days, I asked the young lady missionary, we're going to be together for quite some time. So I go to church on Sunday. Why do you go to church on Saturday? She opened up the Bible to me and showed me the fourth commandment about church, that obeying, remember the Sabbath. And I immediately closed my Bible, and I slammed it closed, and I that was the end of that conversation. I had some in my family telling me that if I became an Adventist, if I became an Adventist by the time I came back, that they would disown me. And so when she showed me remember the Sabbath, it wasn't where I wanted to go. I couldn't go there emotionally, and I couldn't go there spiritually. And I didn't think it mattered which day. Who cares if you go to church on Saturday or Sunday, I thought. I then got into my clinic, and I got into a routine. And I happened to read a book that from my very first mission trip that I had told you about in part 1 of my story. She had given me a book. The lady missionary, when I went down to Mexico, she gave me a book. And I started reading that book while I was on the boat, because sometimes it would take hours or a day or 2 or even 3 days to get to the next village. And during that time, I would be reading in my Bible. I'd be reading another book, because I brought one book in my Bible, and and an electronic Bible, look up words and have it electronically. I started reading that book, and by the time I got done with that book, I was amazed. My eyes were open, and the whole gist of that book was Christianity is so far from the truth of God that we can't even recognize it anymore. What an eye revelation to me. And I said, well, God, has my church taught me anything wrong? And the first thing, and I was reading, I was praying, I was in my Bible, and the first thing that came to my mind was the Sabbath. And I literally held out my arm to God, and I said, no, God, I'm not going there, and I'm not ready. And I closed my Bible again, and I said, Lord, is there anything else that my church has taught me wrong? I opened up my Bible again, and then a thought came to me. I had always thought that my husband, who had died, that you'll hear from my first testimony, I'd always thought he was in heaven watching me, which made me very uncomfortable. I never wanted to marry again because I didn't want heaven to be a miserable place for him, because I didn't know what he would think about that. So I never wanted to get married, and everything that I did in my life, it revolved around knowing that he was watching me, or believing that he was watching me. So I just thought, I'm just going to look up in the Bible about where people go when they die. I wonder if people just sleep, because I've heard that in the past as well. Or do they go straight to heaven? Because I've heard that. Or are people, are they reincarnated? Because I've heard that before. So I started looking up in the Bible. I did a thorough search, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. I found in the Old Testament time and time again where the patriarch of the family, he begat somebody else, another male son, and when he died, he slept. And then when that son died, he slept. And when his son died, he slept. And I started reading all these, and my mind is thinking, wait a minute. And then when I started reading in the New Testament, because I started with the Old and I went to the New, and I said, Lord, what about the New Testament? Has that changed? And then I started reading about how Jesus, when he died, and then he was walking on earth, but yet he tells Mary, don't touch me. I've not gone to my Father yet. I thought, well, that's a strange thing to say. If we die, and if as soon as we die, we go to heaven. And then I started wondering about Lazarus, where when Lazarus died, Jesus says that he's not died, he's sleeping. And that when he was rose from the dead, that he talked nothing of heaven. And then I read where Stephen died, and he slept. The King James says he slept when he was stoned to death. I started reading all these things, and then I read in Isaiah where in the new heaven and the new earth that we're going to go from one that there will be we'll go from one Sabbath to another. So I thought, well, that's interesting. That we're going to that's a Sabbath verse, and so I just started piecing all these together, and I realized that my husband was actually sleeping. And then I found just a few verses that alluded to the point that maybe he was in heaven right away. But then I realized that these were incorrect, and that I needed to stand on truth and not a few verses that appeared to be vague and not very clear compared to all these other verses that are extremely clear. I think I read 57 or 58 places in the Bible where it says that when we die, we sleep. So I felt like that was such a huge burden lifted off of me. And for the first time, I thought, wow, maybe I can marry again. And realizing that he and everybody else, when they die, are sleeping. Then I started reading more in my Bible, because I said, God, it has something else, has my church taught me something else wrong? And And then he started teaching me about the rapture. What I thought was the rapture, and I started learning about the 2300 day prophecy. Now, keep in mind that I was not studying with anybody because I had been told by some in my family that they would disown me if I became an Adventist. So when they offered to study with me, I said, no, thank you. I'll study on my own. I was studying the pastor of the Calvary Chapel that I adored. He was just a wonderful pastor. I learned a lot from him, and thank God for that experience that I had for that year and a half. But I was learning about the 2300 day prophecy in which he shared just before I left. So I started studying the 2300 day prophecy with how he put everything together, and everything fit together except a few verses, which there was a 7-year period which totally got taken out of context. And I thought, well, that's kind of funny. Why was that taken out of context when it seems to belong in with these other time frames of prophecy that are within the 2300 day prophecy? And I started learning about all these dates, and then I realized that was the 7-year period that was actually taken out incorrectly. So I put it back in where it was correct and realized that there was no rapture. And then I started reading more where that each is raised in their own time. The dead in Christ will rise first, and then those the wicked will rise 1,000 years later. I started reading all these kinds of verses, and I thought, wait a minute, everybody's actually still asleep. They're actually dead for 1,000 years, and then Satan is let loose, and then God's people are all in heaven for 1,000 years, and then they come down out of, and then everybody is raised up, and I'm just reading these verses that are so clear. But yet I had incorrectly believed because somebody told me. I had never really dug into my own Bible for myself. Now I'm digging into my own Bible and reading for myself, and with no preconceived ideas of anything. Now I'm distrustful of myself, and I don't know what is true. Then I started looking at, is Jesus God? Is the Holy Spirit God? Is God the Father God? Now I'm really confused. Now at this point, I am laid low. I don't know what to believe anymore. I'm just completely studying all on my own. And I'm in prayer. I'm doing a lot of fasting. The people on the boat were a little concerned about me because I was doing so much fasting, but God was just taking me on one topic after another. And it was just phenomenal. I couldn't believe what I was learning in such a short amount of time. And I finally, after all of this time, it was about about 4.5 months later, I finally said to the Lord, okay, I've learned all these Bible truths now. I would like to actually study the Sabbath. I'm ready to study it because I've now gained experience with you over these last many months. I've gained experience with my Bible. I know I can trust it. I know I can trust you to guide me. And so I'd like to study the Sabbath, but I'm first going to tell you, as if I was telling God, because he's never afraid of our finger pointing at him. And I said, God, I'm going to show you where it got changed from Saturday to Sunday. So I looked at all 8 places in the whole entire Bible where the first day of the week was mentioned. And I noticed that there was no name given to the first day of the week. But yet I kept coming across the word Sabbath, realizing that was the 7th day. And I'm thinking, now, wait a minute. This is the only day that's given a name. And then I started looking in the Old Testament, and is this just a Jewish holiday? or a weekly holiday for them? And does it still apply for modern Christians? Then I started to look at other Sabbath texts in the Bible. I started looking at Sabbath with a small s, Sabbath with a capital S, and realizing, that I didn't know, I was getting way in over my head by doing word searches, but I was also doing topical searches and doing searches with just general topics in general. I then go through I don't remember anymore how many there were, maybe 158 different places that the Sabbath was mentioned. I looked up all 158 places in the Bible. I started writing every single verse down on my paper, no matter what the verse was, no matter if I understood it or not, if it had the word Sabbath, big, whether it was a small or capital S, I wrote it down. So I still have those pieces of paper that has every single verse written down on the Sabbath. And then it started to piece together for me. I started with the Old Testament, then went to the New Testament. And what I was learning was just phenomenal. Couldn't believe it. Then I went back to the verse that I was originally showed by the young lady missionary, that to remember the Sabbath, the fourth commandment. And then I thought, well, that's interesting that the Bible actually says remember. And then I looked up other words that said remember in the Bible. So I started doing a word search and come to find out that when God says remember, that we're actually supposed to remember whatever it is that he's trying to tell us. And so I started picking things apart, and then I realized that the 10 Commandments were not just for the Old Testament, but that they have been brought over into the New Testament through the life of Christ. And he actually kept the 10 Commandments and actually taught them, not as a group, but in his life, he taught them individually. So I realized that way. And then I started realizing that Paul, who lived after Christ, after his death, that he kept the Sabbath, and many of the other disciples kept the Sabbath. And then I even read in Revelation where John writes, on the Sabbath day, I was in a vision on the Lord's day. And so I went up to look, well, what is the Lord's day? Maybe it's Sunday. And then I found out that wasn't true. And then I looked up the Lord's day and started piecing all these things together. And I am fervently studying. I'm fasting and praying and trying to fit in my medical missionary work in between times. And for 5 months, for 4.5 months during this time, I was studying and studying and studying like I had never studied before. It was just me and God and the Bible and my electronic Bible and some paper and a pen. That's all I had for those months. It was truly a time of great learning, being catapulted from one truth to another. My mind was being molded. I was learning new truths. And then I finally said, okay, God, I now believe the Sabbath. I believe it was in the beginning from Genesis in the Garden of Eden, and it's all the way to Revelation, and it's all the way in Isaiah, where you say from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, that all man will come and worship before me, saith the Lord. And it was so clear that the Sabbath was from the beginning of Genesis to the on through beyond our life today on earth. So now realizing that there's some family that I'm going to lose, I started fasting and praying again for what I thought may be the last time. I was so close to my family. I said, God, I can't deal with it. I can't lose my family. I have to know that this truth really makes that much of a difference for you. I have to know that this is important enough I don't question what day is your Sabbath anymore, but my question is, what day is important? Is it important that I go to church on Saturdays and not on Sundays? I don't know how you're going to teach me. I don't know how you're going to convict me or show me. All I know, Lord, is I'm going to fast from today until the day I die, and I am not going to eat anything because I am grieved. I will lose my family, and it has to be worth it to me to lose, those who say that they will disown me. It has to be worth it to me to know that I have to know that I know, because as soon as I lose my family, then I may buckle, and I fear that I'm going to buckle and go back to Sunday and then compromise. I don't want to compromise on your word. And that verse from Matthew 10:37 came back to me. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. I read that again, and I said, Lord, it's got to be worth it. I'm willing to go there. Take me where you want me to go. I started to fast. I didn't know how long I was going to fast. I literally thought I may fast to death. All I knew was that I was going to fast between now and the day I was going to die, unless God intervened, and I had no idea how or when that would happen. From that moment on, my spiritual acumen became high. I was acutely aware of everything around me, of everything that everybody said, of every word that I read in the Bible, of every prayer that I uttered, of every voice or every word that I believe that came from God. I was so acutely aware, and I had to have proof enough that it was without question. I could not question it without any question, any hesitancy whatsoever. I had to know 100% that it was true. My family was on the line, and I was just heartbroken realizing that I may lose some of them. And I just couldn't bear the thought. To me, I would have much rather died than lose my family. So that was the choice that I took. I chose to die instead of losing my family. And I said, Lord, if you choose not to intervene, I guess I will die. I can't, I'm not going to be able to take the pain after the loss of my husband. I can't handle the loss of my family as well. I would rather just die and not deal with that kind of pain again. I didn't know when or where or under what circumstances God would show me. One of the things that God had showed me before was to trust him during all these mission trips. And I chose to trust him again. And I knew at some point that he would intervene. And I just knew he would, but I didn't know when. All I know is I needed to know that I needed to know. Day one, and I am acutely aware of everything, nothing. I go to bed, I'm saying my prayers, I'm listening intently to God's voice as he speaks back to me, still nothing. I wait for day two, and God tells me to actually get off the boat. So I'm off the boat. I'm looking in nature. I'm looking in anything where I might find an answer. How will I know that I know? I don't even know to even know how to even know, if you know what I mean. So all I knew was that it just had to come to me somehow. On day two and day three, I believe it was on near day four, maybe day 3.5. I don't really remember anymore. But I was near day four, and I walked into the pastor's house in town because we were docked at that time because he wanted to see his wife. And I was walking into the pastor's house, and he's watching a DVD. And I told the pastor, so by now I know Portuguese, and I'll tell you that story in another session as well. So now I know Portuguese, and I'm talking to the pastor, and I said, oh, well, when did you get your DVD? Because we were talking on we were talking earlier a few months ago that you wanted to get a DVD player. And so when did it come? Because I see that you have a DVD player. And he said, well, it just came today. I said, well, that's interesting. And when did you, how long have you had that DVD? Because it is in English, but being dubbed over in Portuguese. And he said, well, I also just got that. And I said, so you just got both those today? And he said, well, I just got the DVD player today, but I've had the DVD itself, or it wasn't a DVD, it would have been a VHS. DVD would have been too early from 22 years ago. So it was a VHS. And I said, well, that's strange. I mean, how do you, it's in English. And he said, yes, but it's being dubbed over in Portuguese. And something told my mind and my heart, my answer was in that DVD, but I was still fasting. The other young lady missionary, she had already asked me to go into Peru with her to do some errands. And I said, yes, because we were in Brazil. And so when we were docked, we were very close to Colombia and Peru, right there in the interchange of all three countries. So we popped over into Peru, and she wanted to know if I wanted an ice cream. And I said, no, thank you. I'm fasting. I'm looking for an answer. I don't believe that I told them what I was fasting for, but they were getting quite concerned because I was nearing day 4 of fasting. And they knew that I was searching for something spiritual, but I don't believe that they knew what it was. And so she said, well, you just told me that your answer is in that VHS at the pastor's house. And I said, yes, I know that's where my answer is, but I don't have my answer yet. So I don't want to quit fasting until I actually have my answer. I know where the answer is. So she wanted an ice cream anyway, and it was quite cute. But she continued to enjoy her ice cream. I sat across the booth from her as she thoroughly enjoyed lick after lick of her ice cream, kind of teasingly and taunting me to have my own ice cream. And I said no. And so she finished her ice cream. We did our errands. We went back, and I was glued to that video. I started watching it, and I could not believe, but it was Pastor Mark Finley on the Mark of the Beast. My eyes were open so much, learning all I had learned prior about my Bible, learning all the truths now, and now learning about the Sabbath and realizing it was the right day. And now my conviction came so strong watching that video. I knew without a doubt by the time that was done that the Mark of the Beast was something that once we each know about it, we have a personal responsibility to Christ to live up to all the light that we have. And I knew that now I had to live up to the light that I had. I had no questions about the Sabbath anymore. Yes, it does matter. I found out to God what day we go to church on. And he personally convicted me. So I knew that I had to live up to this light now. I started crying, and I got on my knees, and I said, God, I've been so blind. I didn't know. I didn't realize what I was rejecting. Please forgive me. I just didn't know. I had no idea. No one's ever asked me. No one's ever said anything. And, to that moment, I was very grateful no one had, because I just wasn't spiritually ready for something like that. And that was a real important lesson for me to learn as well, when it comes to other people learning about Bible truths. You start where they are, just like the Philip with the eunuch, and started right where he was in the chariot. So I just poured out my sorrow to Christ. I just poured out my sorrow of my disbelief, asking for forgiveness that I may know him again, and that I now know that I will lose my family, and that this conviction is real, but he has to replace my family. I can't lose my family and be in this world all by myself. I was in this world all by myself at 16. And from my first video that you've listened to, I didn't want to be in the world all by myself like that again. I wanted Christ in my life. And I knew that I was at that moment in the crossroads. I was choosing between Christ and my life and my family. And Matthew 10:37 came to mind again. And though these weren't, my sons or daughters, they were still my siblings and other family. And I just couldn't bear it. So I said, God, you've got to give me another family. They may not be my biological family, but give me a spiritual family. And God just opened up the world to me. And he said that I will bring you a family. I knew that he'd bring me a family. I didn't, at that moment in time, I didn't know what kind of a family he'd bring to me, but I just knew that I had the peace that passes all understanding, that he would replace my family. I also knew at that moment, I had such close walk with God at that time. I did not want to eat. During that fasting time of acute awareness and the spiritual acumen, it was so deep and so beautiful, and I was so interconnected with Christ that I didn't want it to end. And I knew that by eating, that there would be distance between us again, and I didn't want that. I just wanted to keep fasting, but God told me, you must eat or you will be in sin. And I had to go eat. I reluctantly, with a big grudge, I went to go eat. I didn't want to, but I did. And then also the knowledge that came to me is that my passport would not be renewed because I was coming upon 5 months and I was supposed to stay for 6. I went to the passport people. I already knew it wasn't going to be, but I just had to check. And sure enough, they did not renew my passport, and I already knew it. So I knew that's what God took me there for. He had to take me out of the city. He had to take me out of the fast life. He had to take me away from my family and friends and all that I knew. And he had to get me to a place where it was just him and me, where he could speak to me and me alone. And yet everybody was so different than me, which actually they weren't. They weren't so different for me. God was just bringing me more closer to them. I saw the difference, the distance before, but I saw the closeness, how God brought us together. And then I went to the pastor's house afterwards. So now it's time for me to go home. I've been there 5 months, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you. But I went to the pastor's house, and I couldn't believe, I was so excited to tell him everything that I'd learned. I went up to him and I said, you will not believe what I've learned about the Sabbath and the state of the dead and the millennium and the second coming and all of these beliefs. And he's just so peacefully standing in the doorway, smiling very contently. And I said, why are you smiling? And he just said, very peacefully said, welcome to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I said, what do you mean? You mean this is what Seventh-day Adventists believe? Because remember, I did not study with them. And he said, yes, all of what you have said is exactly what Seventh-day Adventists believe. I could not believe it. I knew that God had brought me along from where he wanted me to where he wanted me to go. I just thank him so much. And the reason it meant so much to me was because when I was still looking for a church, and I was asking God which church he wanted me to be in. He clearly told me that this is where I want you, but for a time. And so I thank God so much for my Calvary Chapel experience, the experience that I had with other Christians, with other pastors. It meant so much to me because it helped me to grow, and it helped me to understand the Lord more, it helped me to trust him more, and I needed that time to grow. into more of the Bible truths, because so many Christians believe what others have told them rather than really digging into their Bible. Because I was at a point where I didn't care what the truth was. I didn't care what my belief was. I didn't care. I had really no preconceived ideas because I came out of atheism. All I wanted was just to know the truth. I didn't care who had truth. I didn't care anything. I didn't even care what the truth was. All I knew was that I wanted to know what the Bible said. And I just thank God so, so much. And He's so willing to guide each one of us. And when I went home to finish that story, yes, those family who said they'd disown me, they did. But then I realized that God had brought me into a worldwide family. He brought me into the worldwide family of the Seventh-day Adventists. And as I continued to do a lot of mission work around the world, continued to do that, I found a home wherever I went. I was never without a home, never had to stay in a hotel. People were always glad to house me for any of the lectures, any of the time I was doing mission work. I truly came into a worldwide body of believers all around the world. And I'm proud now to say that I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. So I encourage each one of you, go with courage where God wants you to go. Don't be fearful, but rejoice that He's leading you, and embrace the Bible truths. Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, you are truly magnificent. Lord, if you can reach the heart of an atheist, you can reach the heart of anybody. And Lord, I pray for each one of us and each listener that they may have courage and the holy boldness to follow and to stand up for truth and to stand in truth, though it may be counterculture in some ways. Give each one of us, Lord, a portion of your Spirit that we may do your will and that we may know you more, that we may glorify your name in every way. In Jesus' precious name I pray. Amen.